The declaration came in a language no one had spoken for 6,000 years. Not because the Vuluth reclamation had forgotten it. They had not forgotten it. They had maintained it with the specific, deliberate care of people who understood that the language was not just communication but statement, that speaking it was itself the message before the words began, that arriving at this moment in this language said everything that needed to be said about what the Vuluth reclamation was, and what it remembered, and what it had been waiting to say. The language was the language of the original Vuluth sovereignty, the civilization that had existed 6,000 years ago before the event that the Vuluth reclamation called the Sundering, and that the Conclave's historical records called the Vuluth collapse, and that the actual record, assembled from the fragments of what had survived, described as something that was neither a sundering nor a collapse, but the thing that happened when a civilization that had reached a certain scale encountered another civilization that was also reaching a certain scale, and the encounter was badly managed by both parties, and the consequences were catastrophic in ways that neither party had intended and both parties had produced. The other party, 6,000 years ago, had been humanity. In a different form. Humanity before the conclave, before the 42 years of membership, before all of it. Humanity when it was still largely confined to its own system, when the first generation of faster-than-light capable vessels were beginning to push into the space beyond, when the pilots and commanders of those first vessels were doing what first explorers did, which was making contact in the ways that first explorers made contact before the protocols existed, before the frameworks had been developed, before anyone understood what first contact at an interstellar scale actually required. What they had done had not been deliberate. What it had produced had been catastrophic. The Vuluth sovereignty had been a spacefaring civilization for 400 years when humanity's first generation of FTL vessels entered what the sovereignty considered its territory. The encounter had been confused, had been escalated, had produced a conflict that lasted 60 years, and ended in the way that conflicts between a civilization with 400 years of FTL experience and a civilization with 11 years ended, which was with the civilization that had 11 years losing in ways that were permanent. Permanent for humanity at the time had meant losing the first 3 generations of FTL-capable vessels, and the crews that flew them, and the infrastructure that had built them, and the 2 colonies that had been established in the contested space, and which no longer existed by the time the conflict ended. Permanent for the Vuluth sovereignty had meant something else. The conflict had not ended because one party defeated the other. It had ended because of what humanity had done at the end of it, when it had become clear that the losing was going to be permanent, and the only question was the scale of what was lost. Humanity had done something that the Vuluth sovereignty's command structure had not modeled as a possible response, something that the Vuluth sovereignty's strategic planning had not included in its contingency library, because nothing in the sovereignty's 400 years of FTL experience had produced a situation in which the less capable party did this specific thing. What humanity had done was burn the bridge. Not a metaphor. A physical act, the destruction of the 3 transit nodes that connected the contested space to the Vuluth sovereignty's core territory, transit nodes that the sovereignty had built and maintained, and that were the infrastructure through which everything moved, through which the sovereignty's economic integration was maintained, through which the sovereignty existed as a single entity rather than a collection of separate systems that happened to share a name. Humanity had destroyed all 3 in the same hour. The Vuluth sovereignty had survived the loss. But surviving it had taken everything the sovereignty had taken generations of reconstruction and reorganization, and the specific kind of institutional trauma that civilizations carried when the thing they had built and depended on was suddenly gone, and the trauma had fractured the sovereignty in ways that the reconstruction could not fully heal, had produced the internal divisions that had grown across the next several centuries into the thing that eventually called itself the Voloth reclamation, and that had spent 6,000 years understanding itself as the heir of something that had been taken by humanity. The declaration was transmitted on the Conclave's open frequency at 300 on a Wednesday, which was the Voloth reclamation's choice of time, and the Wednesday was coincidental, but 300 was not, because 300 was when the original Voloth sovereignty's vessels had entered the contested space 6,000 years ago, and the reclamation had chosen this time deliberately because the language and the time and the declaration together were the message. We remember, we have always remembered, and now we are here. The declaration said, translated from the 6,000-year-old language that no one outside the reclamation had spoken since the sovereignty collapsed. The Voloth reclamation formally declares a state of war with the civilization known as humanity, in reclamation of the territory, the resources, the vessels, the crews, and the institutional continuity of which the Voloth sovereignty was deprived by human action 6,000 years ago. This declaration is not negotiable. This war will conclude when what was taken has been restored. We have been preparing for this moment for 6,000 years. We are ready. The Conclave's monitoring systems received the declaration at 303 seconds. The alert reached Senior Arbiter Nullan at 3:04. She was awake. She had been awake since 2:45 because the Monitoring Division's early warning system had flagged unusual Voloth reclamation activity 3 days ago, and she had been sleeping poorly since the flag, the specific poor sleep of someone who was expecting something and did not know when it was going to arrive. She read the declaration. She read it in the original language, which she had studied for this reason, because the Monitoring Division's flag had included analysis suggesting that the reclamation was preparing a formal action, and that the formal action would be in the sovereignty's original language, and she had spent 3 days learning enough of it to read the declaration when it came. She read it. She sat with it. She called Ambassador Ruz. Ruz answered on the first signal. She was also awake. She had been awake for the same reason. Nullan said, "You have seen it." Reyes said, "Yes." Nullan said, "The language." Reyes said, "We had translators prepared." Nullan said, "You knew it would be in the original language." Reyes said, "We expected it." Nullan said, "You have been expecting this." Reyes said, "Yes." Nullan said, "For how long?" Reyes said, "For a while." Nullan said, "The Monitoring Division flagged unusual reclamation activity 3 days ago." Reyes said, "We flagged it 14 months ago." Nullan held that. She said 14 months. Reyes said, "Yes." Nullan said, "And you have been preparing?" Reyes said, "Yes." Nullan said, "The declaration says they have been preparing for 6,000 years." Reyes said, "Yes." Nullan said, "And Earth has been preparing for 14 months." Reyes was quiet for a moment. She said, "Earth has been preparing for longer than 14 months. 14 months is when we identified the specific timeline for the declaration. The preparation has a longer history." Nullan said, "How much longer?" Reyes said, "I would like to brief the Security Council, this morning if possible." Nullan said, "I will convene it at 700. Reyes said, "I will be there." She ended the call. Nullan looked at the declaration on her display, at the 6,000-year-old language and the 300 timestamp, and the words "We have been preparing for this moment for 6,000 years." She thought about 14 months. She thought about longer than 14 months. She thought about what longer meant in the context of this specific situation, and this specific history, and this specific civilization that had spent 42 years in the Conclave being the thing it was. She thought it was probably a very interesting number. At 700, the Security Council convened. All 17 senior arbiters were present. The session had the quality of a room that had been awake since 300, and that was processing something that had the specific weight of things that had been coming for a long time and had arrived. Ambassador Reyes walked in at 6:59. She had with her a woman who she introduced as Dr. Amara Solano, director of Earth's Historical Continuity Division, which was a division that none of the council members had heard of, and that was not in the publicly available directory of Earth's governmental structure. Several council members noted this. None of them asked about it immediately, because Reyes had the quality she had when she walked into rooms where something important was going to be said, the quality of someone who had already resolved the internal question and was here to share the resolution, and that quality produced in the people around her a willingness to wait for the resolution rather than interrupt the approach to it. Reyes said, "The Security Council has received the Valeth Reclamation's declaration of war. I want to address several things about this situation, in order, beginning with the history and ending with the current strategic position." She looked at the council. She said, 6,000 years ago, humanity caused the Valeth collapse. This is in the historical record, and it is accurate. The cause was not deliberate in the sense of a planned program of destruction. It was the product of first contact mismanagement and escalation, and a final act that was desperate rather than calculated. The Valeth sovereignty lost something that it had spent 400 years building, and the loss fractured it in ways that produced the reclamation as the inheritor of that fracture. She paused. She said, "Earth does not dispute the history. The history happened. What happened to the Valeth sovereignty was real, and the consequences were real, and the reclamation's understanding of itself as the heir of something that was taken has a factual basis." Councillor Drethon said, "You are acknowledging the historical grievance." Reyes said, "I am stating what happened accurately. The historical grievance has a factual basis. The declaration of war is based on that grievance. These are separate questions from what the correct response to the declaration is." She said, "I want to address the current strategic situation, which requires understanding what the Valeth reclamation has and what Earth has." She nodded to Dr. Solano. Dr. Solano placed a device on the presentation table. The device opened an aperture, the standard Earth presentation tool now familiar to the Council, showing a spatial map of the Valeth reclamation's territory and surrounding space. She said, "The Valeth reclamation has been building toward this declaration for 6,000 years. What 6,000 years of institutional focus produces is significant. The reclamation's military capacity, based on Earth's intelligence assessment, represents the largest non-conclave military force that has ever existed in this region of space. They are significantly larger than the Rethkai. They are significantly larger than anything the Conclave has faced as a unified threat." The Council looked at the map. Drethon said, "And Earth." Solano said, "Earth has been watching the reclamation for 200 years. The specific assessment of the reclamation's 6,000-year preparation timeline was completed 14 months ago. Earth began accelerated preparation at that point." She paused. She said, "But the preparation that the 14-month acceleration built on is itself the product of a much longer program. A program that Earth has been running since the historical record of the Valeth collapse was fully understood. Since Earth understood what it had caused 6,000 years ago, and understood that the consequences might eventually produce a moment like this one." Nalan said, "How long has Earth been running this program?" Solano said, "The formal program designation was established 40 years ago, 2 years after Earth joined the Conclave." The Council was quiet. Drethon said, "Earth joined the Conclave and within 2 years had established a formal program to prepare for the possibility that the Valeth reclamation would eventually declare war." Solano said, "Earth joined the Conclave and within 2 years had established a formal program to prepare for the consequences of what Earth had caused 6,000 years ago. The preparation was not only military. It was diplomatic, historical, cultural, and strategic. The military component was one part of a larger effort to be ready for this moment. In every dimension it required readiness. Nalan said, "What does the military component look like?" Solano looked at Reyes. Reyes said, "I want to address the military component in the context of what we intend to do with it, because the military component is not the answer to this situation. It is the foundation that makes the answer possible." The council looked at her. She said, "The Valith Reclamation declared war because they believe that what was taken from the Valith sovereignty can be restored through force. They have spent 6,000 years building toward a moment when their force is sufficient to make that belief actionable. The declaration is the moment they have decided they are ready." She said, "Earth's response is not to tell them they are wrong about the force. Earth's response is to change what the force is for." Drethon said, "Explain." She said, "The reclamation wants what was taken from the sovereignty restored. The territory, the resources, the vessels, the crews, the institutional continuity. They have itemized it in the declaration. They want what was lost." She paused. She said, "Some of what was lost cannot be restored. The vessels and the crews from 6,000 years ago are beyond restoration. The colonies are gone. These are permanent losses and we cannot undo them." She said, "Some of what was lost can be addressed, not restored, addressed. The territory, the resources, the institutional continuity of a civilization that was fractured by something humanity caused. These are things that 6,000 years of preparation to address look like something." She said, "I want to tell the council what 40 years of a formal program, built on 200 years of watching and understanding, produces when it is ready." She nodded again to Solano. Solano changed the aperture display. What it showed now was not a map of the reclamation's territory. It was a different map. The council looked at it. Then the council looked at it more carefully. Then several council members began asking questions simultaneously, because the map was showing something that produced questions faster than the questions could be organized into an order. What the map was showing was a fleet. Not the fleet that Earth had shown the council 8 months ago, the formation that had transited the corridor past Conclave Station Primara on a scheduled exercise. A different fleet, larger, in a different location. In a location that was not in Conclave space, and was not in the Reclamation space, but was in the space between them. The space that the Conclave's cartographic database described as uninhabited. The space beyond the survey boundary that Earth's exploration program had been mapping beyond the Conclave's operational range. In that space, a fleet that had been there for a period that the display's timestamp indicated was not months, but years. "Waiting," Nalan said, "This fleet, how long has it been in that location?" Solano said, "The forward elements have been positioned for 6 years. The full formation has been at current strength for 14 months, since the specific timeline for the declaration was confirmed." Nalan said, 6 years. Solano said, "Yes." Nalan said, "And the Reclamation's intelligence did not identify it." Solano said, "The fleet is in uninhabited space beyond the Conclave's survey boundary. The Reclamation's intelligence focus has been on Conclave space and on Earth's known military infrastructure. The fleet is neither of those things." Drethon said, "How large?" Solano said the number. The council was quiet for a long time. Araz, who was a physicist and who had been doing calculations since the display changed, said, "The drive signatures on those vessels. The configuration." Solano said, "Yes." Araz said, "That is not the standard dark matter composite configuration." Solano said, "No." Araz said, "That is the application of the instant relocation drive technology at fleet scale." Solano said, "Yes." Araz said, The fleet can relocate instantaneously. Solano said, individual vessels and formation elements can relocate instantaneously within calculated parameters. Yes. Arai said, to any location within those parameters. Solano said, yes. Arai said, and the parameters, Solano said, are sufficient for this situation. The council processed that. Nalon said, Ambassador Reyes, you said the military component is the foundation that makes the answer possible. What is the answer? Reyes said, the answer is what we have been preparing for 40 years to offer, not a counter-declaration, not a demonstration of force that ends the declaration by making it impossible to pursue. Something that the reclamation has not modeled as a possible response, because nothing in 6,000 years of preparing to take something back has included the possibility that the thing you are going to take back would be offered. Drethon said, what is being offered? Reyes said, a formal accounting, everything that the Valith sovereignty lost that can be quantified, a formal acknowledgement by Earth of what humanity caused 6,000 years ago, and a negotiated framework for addressing what can be addressed, not by force, but by the recognition that 6,000 years of carrying a legitimate grievance deserves a response that is proportional to the weight of what it has cost to carry it. Nalon said, you are proposing to sit at a table with a civilization that just declared war on you. Reyes said, I am proposing to offer a civilization that just declared war on us the thing they actually want, which is not war. War is the mechanism they built because they did not have another mechanism available. We are offering another mechanism. Nalon said, and if they decline the mechanism? Reyes said, then the fleet in uninhabited space changes the calculation in ways that make continuing to pursue the war mechanism significantly more expensive than the alternative. She paused. She said, but I do not think they will decline. I think 6,000 years of preparing to take something back and being met with an offer to address the legitimate grievance that drove the preparation is not something the reclamation has modeled. I think it will produce a moment of genuine uncertainty about what the correct response is. And in that moment of uncertainty, the table is available. The council looked at her. Nalon said, the fleet in uninhabited space. Does the reclamation know about it? Reyes said they know now. Nalon said, when did they find out? Reyes said, approximately 40 minutes ago. Earth transmitted the fleet's coordinates and configuration to the reclamation's command structure simultaneously with this briefing. The council was very quiet. Nalon said, you told them. Reyes said, we told them, because the offer of a table and the existence of the fleet are not separate messages. They are the same message. The message is, we know what we caused and we have spent 40 years preparing to address it, and we have also spent 40 years preparing for the alternative, and we are offering you the choice of which one this is. She looked at the council. She said, the declaration said they have been preparing for 6,000 years and they are ready. We want them to know that we have been preparing too, and that what we are ready for is not the war. What we are ready for is the conversation that should have happened 6,000 years ago, and that did not happen because neither party was ready for it. She paused. She said, we are ready for it now. Nalon looked at the map showing the fleet in uninhabited space, at the timestamp showing 6 years of positioning, at the formation of vessels with instant relocation drives sitting in the space between the conclave and the reclamation's territory, waiting. She thought about 40 years of a formal program. She thought about 200 years of watching and understanding. She thought about a civilization that had caused something 6,000 years ago, and had understood what it caused, and had spent the time since preparing to answer for it in every dimension the answering required. She thought about the fleet and the table, and the message that was both simultaneously. She said, Ambassador Reyes, the reclamation's response to the fleet coordinates. Reyes said, "We have not received a response yet." Nalon said, "How long do you expect it to take?" Reyes said, "Not long. The Reclamation's command structure received the coordinates 40 minutes ago. They are currently doing what anyone does when they receive information that fundamentally changes their understanding of the situation they are in." She said, "They are recalculating." Nalon said, "And when the recalculation is complete?" Reyes said, "One of two things. They continue with the declaration and we find out what the fleet is for, or they respond to the offer of a table." She paused. She said, "I believe they will respond to the offer of a table, not because the fleet makes the alternative impossible, because the offer of a table is the thing that 6,000 years of preparation could not have prepared them for." Nalon said, "Why not?" Reyes said, "Because you cannot prepare for someone taking responsibility. You can prepare for every version of opposition and every version of escalation and every version of what the entity that caused the harm does when it is confronted with the harm. You cannot prepare for the entity that caused the harm saying, 'Yes, this is what we caused, and here is what we have prepared to do about it, and here is our offer, and here is 40 years of the work that went into the offer, and here is the table.'" She said, 6,000 years of preparation did not include that. We know because we have been studying their preparation for 200 years, and the table is not in it. Nalon said, "And that is the thing you are offering." Reyes said, "The table is always the thing we offer. The fleet is why the table is worth taking seriously." The council held that. At 8:22, 22 minutes into the Security Council session, Ambassador Reyes received a message on her personal communication system. She read it. She looked at the council. She said, "The Valith Reclamation Senior Command has requested a bilateral communication at Earth's earliest convenience to discuss the framework for addressing the formal accounting referenced in Earth's transmitted message." The council was very quiet. Nalon said, "They responded in 82 minutes. Reyes said, "Yes." Nalon said, "To a 6,000-year declaration of war." Reyes said, "To the offer of a table." Nalon said, 82 minutes. Reyes said, "They recalculated faster than I expected." Nalon said, "What does 82 minutes tell you?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. She thought about 6,000 years, about the weight of 6,000 years of carrying a legitimate grievance, about what it was like to carry something for that long and to have built everything around the carrying, and to have finally arrived at the moment you had been building toward and to receive, instead of the opposition you had prepared for, an offer of a table. She said, 82 minutes tells me they were ready for a war, and they were not ready for this, and 82 minutes was how long it took the thing they were not ready for to become the thing they wanted more than the war. She said, 6,000 years of preparing to take something back, and what they actually wanted, underneath the preparation, was for someone to acknowledge that it was taken. She said, "The table acknowledges it." Nalon held that. She said, "And the fleet?" Reyes said, "The fleet is why the acknowledgement is serious. A table offered from weakness is a concession. A table offered from a fleet that instantly locates anywhere in the region is a choice." She said, "We chose the table." Nalon looked at the map, at the fleet, at the timestamp, at 40 years of a program and the 82-minute response to the offer it had taken 40 years to be ready to make. She said, "When does the bilateral communication happen?" Reyes said, "I told them this morning." Nalon said, "This morning." Reyes said, "They have been waiting 6,000 years. I do not think they will benefit from waiting longer." Nalon looked at her. She said, "Ambassador Reyes." Reyes said, "Senior Arbiter." Nalon said, "The fleet in uninhabited space." Reyes said, "Yes." Nalon said, "It has been there for 6 years." Reyes said, "The forward elements, yes." Nalon said, in uninhabited space beyond the survey boundary? Reyes said yes. Nalon said, and the conclave did not know. Reyes said no. Nalon said, is there anything else in uninhabited space beyond the survey boundary that the conclave does not know about? Reyes was quiet for a moment. She said, that is a longer conversation. Nalon said, yes. Reyes said, I'm happy to have it. Nalon said, after the bilateral communication with the reclamation. Reyes said, yes. Nalon said, and after the framework for addressing the formal accounting. Reyes said, yes, there is a sequence. Nalon said, there is always a sequence. Reyes said, yes, we have learned that. She stood. She said, I should prepare for the communication. Nalon said, yes. She said, the council will have a full briefing when the framework is established. Nalon said, yes. Reyes walked to the door. She stopped. She said, the declaration was in the 6,000-year-old language. We had translators prepared. Nalon said, I studied it for 3 days. Reyes said, I know. The monitoring division's flag was forwarded to my office. Nalon said, you knew I would prepare. Reyes said, I knew you would do what the situation required. Nalon said, yes. Reyes said, so did we. She left. The council sat in the session for another 40 minutes processing what had happened. Processing the declaration and the history, and the 40 years, and the 6 years, and the 82 minutes, and the table that was being prepared right now in Ambassador Reyes' office for a communication with a civilization that had spent 6,000 years building toward a war, and had received, in 82 minutes, an offer that was not the war. The offer of what should have happened 6,000 years ago, which was the only thing that had ever been going to end it. Outside the council chamber, on Conclave Station Primara, the ordinary business of the galaxy continued. Ships docked and departed. Diplomatic cables were drafted. The 17,000 civilizations that made up the conclave went about their ordinary lives. In uninhabited space beyond the survey boundary, a fleet waited. Not for war. For the outcome of a conversation that should have happened 6,000 years ago, and that was finally, today, going to happen. The fleet had been ready for 6 years. The conversation was ready now. That was the sequence. That was how it worked.